Chronicle still talks about that summer night in 1969 when two teams showed up at the same drag strip and turned organized racing into a personal war. On one side, Sox and Martin with their screaming Plymouth Cuda, and on the other, Grumpy Jenkins in his Camaro that sounded like it was powered by controlled explosions. What started as professional competition became the most bitter rivalry in drag racing history. Two different philosophies, two different approaches to speed, and two teams who genuinely couldn't stand each other. This is the story of Sox and Martin versus Grumpy Jenkins, the rivalry that split drag racing right down the middle and made every gearhead pick a side. One team believed in Plymouth's raw power, the other in Chevrolet's engineering precision. One built cars that looked like they escaped from a cartoon. The other created mechanical perfection that whispered death threats. Wait until you hear what happened when they finally faced off at the 1970 NHRA Nationals. The aftermath changed professional drag racing forever and created a feud that lasted decades. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin didn't start out planning to become drag racing legends. Sox was a Carolina boy who could make any engine sing, and Martin was the businessman who knew how to turn speed into profit. Together, they became the most successful pro stock team of the early 1970s, but success came with a price that nearly destroyed them both. Walking into their shop in 1968 was like entering a temple dedicated to Mopar engineering. Plymouth Cudas in various stages of preparation lined the walls, each one stripped down to its essence and rebuilt for one purpose: going faster than anything else on four wheels. The smell of racing fuel and tire rubber was so thick you could taste it 3 blocks away. Sox had hands that seemed to understand metal and horsepower on some deeper level. He could listen to an engine idle and tell you exactly what was wrong, what was right, and how to make it better. When he worked on a 340 small block, it became something that could embarrass big blocks twice its size. When he touched a 426 Hemi, it became a mechanical weapon that redefined what street cars could do. Martin handled the business side, but he understood racing in ways that went beyond spreadsheets and sponsorship deals. He knew that winning races meant everything in the muscle car world, and he was willing to spend whatever it took to make sure Sox had the best equipment money could buy. Their breakthrough came with the Plymouth Cuda, a car that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that subtlety was overrated. Those bright colors and aggressive stance weren't just for show, they were warnings to every other team that something serious was approaching the starting line. Bill Grumpy Jenkins got his nickname honestly. He was perpetually irritated by everything: track conditions, other drivers, fans who asked too many questions, and especially anyone who suggested that Plymouth or Ford could build better race cars than Chevrolet. That permanent scowl became his trademark, but underneath the grumpiness was mechanical genius that made Chevrolet small blocks into giant killers. Jenkins approached drag racing like a scientist conducting deadly experiments. His shop in Pennsylvania was organized with military precision, every tool in its place, every engine component measured and weighed. While other teams relied on gut instinct and trial and error, Jenkins used mathematics and engineering principles to extract maximum performance from every cubic inch. The Camaro he campaigned was deceptively simple looking. No wild graphics, no outrageous colors, just clean lines and purposeful modifications that served specific aerodynamic and weight distribution functions. When that Camaro rolled to the starting line, it looked almost boring compared to the flashy Plymouth Cudas and Dodge Challengers it raced against. But boring was exactly what Jenkins wanted. Let the other teams waste time on appearance while he focused on what really mattered, making his 327 cubic inch small block produce power numbers that shouldn't have been possible. His engines were so precisely built that other teams accused him of using illegal modifications, which only made Jenkins grumpier and more determined to prove Chevrolet's superiority. Jenkins had a particular hatred for teams that relied on big displacement engines to make power. In his mind, anyone could make a 440 or 454 go fast. Real engineering meant making a small block Chevy embarrass the big boys. Sox and Martin's success with Plymouth Power represented everything Jenkins thought was wrong with drag racing. The rivalry between Sox and Martin and Grumpy Jenkins wasn't just about winning races. It was about two completely different approaches to making cars go fast. and neither team could accept that the other might be right. Sox believed in displacement and raw power. Give him a 426 Hemi or 446 pack, and he'd tune it until it produced torque numbers that could twist the earth off its axis. His philosophy was simple. More cubic inches meant more power, and more power meant faster quarter-mile times. When you had engines that made 500-plus horsepower, why complicate things with fancy engineering? Jenkins represented the opposite philosophy. He believed that intelligence and precision engineering could overcome brute force every time. His small-block Chevrolets were masterpieces of efficiency, producing more power per cubic inch than seemed physically possible. Every component was chosen for maximum performance. Every modification served a specific purpose. The personal animosity started at the 1969 NHRA Winter Nationals, when Jenkins publicly questioned whether Sox and Martin's CUDA was running a legal engine. He suggested that nobody could make a 340 small block run the times they were posting without serious rule violations. Sox took this as a direct attack on his integrity and fired back with comments about Jenkins being a bitter old man who couldn't accept that Plymouth built better engines. From that point forward, every race where both teams appeared became a referendum on their competing philosophies. The drag racing community split into camps. Team Plymouth supporting Sox and Martin's raw power approach, and Team Chevrolet backing Jenkins' precision engineering methods. Track announcers started billing their matchups as the Battle of the Philosophies, and fans would drive hundreds of miles just to watch these two teams settle their differences on the quarter mile. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a wrench. The 1970 NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis became the stage for the most intense showdown in drag racing history. Both teams had spent the entire season building toward this moment, each convinced they would finally settle the question of Plymouth versus Chevrolet supremacy. Sox and Martin arrived with their latest CUDA creation, powered by a 340 small block that had been tuned to perfection. The engine bay looked like mechanical artwork, every component polished, every line clean, every detail focused on extracting maximum performance. Ronnie Sox had spent months preparing this engine, and he was confident it could outrun anything Jenkins brought to the track. Jenkins rolled in with his newest Camaro, powered by a 327 that looked almost stock from the outside, but contained internal modifications that pushed the boundaries of what NHRA rules allowed. The engine note was different from anything else in the staging lanes, a precise, mechanical sound that suggested violence barely contained by engineering. The first round of eliminations went as expected, with both teams advancing easily, but the real drama happened in the staging lanes between rounds, where crew members from both teams traded insults and accusations that had nothing to do with professional competition and everything to do with personal hatred. When Sox and Martin and Jenkins finally faced each other in the semifinals, the entire facility went silent. This wasn't just a race, it was the culmination of 2 years of bitter rivalry, public arguments, and fundamentally different beliefs about what made cars fast. The Christmas tree started its sequence, and both drivers launched with perfect reaction times. For the first 100 feet, the two cars ran side by side, neither gaining an advantage. Then Jenkins's Camaro began to pull ahead, and Sox responded by pushing his CUDA harder than he'd ever pushed any car before. What happened next changed everything about how these teams raced each other. Jenkins crossed the finish line first, but by less than a foot. The time slips showed both cars deep in the 10-second zone, numbers that seemed impossible for the engines they were running. But instead of celebrating his victory, Jenkins was furious about how close the race had been. Sox was devastated by the loss, but more than that, he was angry about what he saw as gamesmanship from the Jenkins team. Accusations flew about illegal engine modifications, fuel additives, and technical violations that had nothing to do with racing skill and everything to do with bending rules. The argument that erupted in the staging lanes after the race became legendary in drag racing circles. Jenkins accused Sox of running an oversized engine disguised as a 340. Sox accused Jenkins of using illegal internal modifications that should have disqualified his Camaro. Track officials tried to mediate, but both teams were beyond reasoning. The rivalry that had driven both teams to achieve incredible performance levels had finally consumed itself. What started as healthy competition had become personal hatred that was destroying the sport they both loved. NHRA officials eventually issued statements saying both engines were legal, but the damage was done. The Sox and Martin versus Jenkins rivalry had shown that professional drag racing could become too personal, too bitter, and too focused on beating one specific opponent rather than advancing the sport. Both teams continued racing, but they never recaptured the pure competitive fire that had made their rivalry legendary. They'd pushed each other to mechanical and professional limits that couldn't be sustained, and in the process, they'd created the template for every great drag racing rivalry that followed. The Sox and Martin versus Grumpy Jenkins rivalry proved that the greatest competition comes from fundamentally different approaches to the same goal. One team believed in raw power and displacement, the other in precision, engineering, and efficiency. Both were right, both were wrong, and both pushed drag racing to heights it had never reached before. Their feud split the drag racing community into camps that lasted for decades. Even today, mention Sox and Martin versus Grumpy Jenkins at any classic muscle car gathering, and you'll restart arguments that began 50 years ago. Some will swear that Plymouth power was the only way to real speed. Others will insist that Chevrolet engineering was superior to brute force. The real legacy isn't who won or lost individual races. It's that these teams showed what was possible when brilliant mechanics refused to accept limitations and pushed American muscle car engineering to its absolute limits. They proved that the greatest rivalries aren't just about beating the competition. They're about forcing everyone involved to become better than they ever thought possible. Which side are you on? Do you believe in Sox and Martin's displacement and power philosophy? Or do you respect Jenkins' precision engineering approach? Let us know in the comments, and get ready to defend your choice, because this argument has been going on for 50 years and shows no signs of stopping. If this story of legendary rivalry and mechanical genius brought back memories of when drag racing was about more than just winning, hit that like button and subscribe. Next week, we're diving into another battle that defined the muscle car era and still makes old-timers argue about who really won. Thanks for riding along through one of drag racing's greatest feuds. Sometimes the best competition comes from people who can't stand each other, but respect what the other can do with a wrench and a dream.